Hello, and welcome to Accessibility at Webflow, how we design with disability in mind. I'm Dr. Michelle A. Williams, owner of MAW Consulting, LLC, making accessibility work. I'm an accessibility and user experience specialist who has been working with Webflow on a variety of their accessibility initiatives.
And I'm Camille Esposito. I'm a manager on Webflow's brand studio team. I've been at Webflow for almost 2 years, first as a web brand designer, and now as a manager of the web designers on our team. Over the past year, Michelle has played a huge role in teaching us more about web accessibility and helping us learn to make our landing pages more accessible.
Today we'll be talking about the brand design team's journey to building with disability in mind, defining what it means to be accessible and inclusive in design, and how you can do the same with your websites with the help of Webflow tools. Our hope is that you'll walk away from this talk with some ideas for how to bring accessibility to the forefront of your web design work.
So to provide some context on the brand design team at Webflow, we design and build, in Webflow, all of our marketing landing pages, everything from our homepage to new feature pages to campaign pages. Initially, we focused on designing landing pages that showcase the design capabilities of Webflow and amazing people with what Webflow could do. This often involved using a lot of motion, showcasing Webflow interactions by using them to create full-screen animations, like in this example, where the images of landing pages fly across the screen, or this example, where the pieces of the landing page rotate through space to eventually land on the Webflow Designer UI. However, teammates started giving us feedback that the animations we were using could actually cause harm to some people and even prevent others from engaging with the pages at all. They told us how the way we used motion could prompt dizziness, migraine, or nausea in people sensitive to motion. We also learned that our color choices could have the same impacts or be difficult for people with visual impairments to distinguish. That includes using text with insufficient contrast and using color combinations that can cause similar harm to motion. And they explained how our mouse-driven events, things like interactions that happen on scroll, hover, or click, made the pages difficult to navigate for people whose disability impacts how they use the computer, like people who use the keyboard rather than a mouse to navigate. They were telling us about digital accessibility, which in retrospect, we didn't know much about at the time.
Let's pause here for a moment to talk more about digital accessibility. Note this is often shortened to A11Y due to the 11 letters between the A and the Y. First, let's start with the most basic point. It is possible for someone with a disability to use technology. Often this happens with the help of tools and techniques known collectively as assistive technology, or AT. Camille mentioned one of the most commonly used assistive technologies in the form of solely using the keyboard. This is an alternative hardware setup where people just use keyboard keys like Tab to navigate a page. This is helpful to people with motor and mobility impairments who may find moving and clicking a mouse difficult, painful, or simply not possible. AT can also be software like using magnification, which enlarges the view of a screen as if using a magnifying glass over a monitor. This is helpful when one's vision benefits from enlarged views, but also changes how someone uses a mouse to explore the screen when used on desktop. Lastly, AT can take the form of operating system settings. For instance, some people may select a reduce motion setting, which will reduce or eliminate the motion from animations on websites that honor that setting. To make sure these settings and devices are compatible, that is, making technology accessible, and to ensure you're considering the wide diversity of settings, there are accessibility standards for various types of technology. We unfortunately don't often learn about these standards in our respective fields, even though many of them have been around for several years or even decades. For web and mobile, these include WCAG or WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. These standards help provide a checklist-style basis for defining what it means for web applications to be accessible. For example, there are guidelines to make sure there are captions for videos, something many of you may already know. But there are lesser known but equally important guidelines, such as one to ensure you can pause, stop, or hide motion as it may be too distracting for people with attention deficits or cause motion sickness, as Camille was explaining. Often people think accessibility only means considering needs of people who are totally blind. People may have heard of screen readers, the primary assistive technology used by blind computer users, and thus they base all of their decisions on their understanding of what it may mean to use a system without vision. While it is important to consider this given our focus on graphical user interfaces, we must also keep in mind the diversity of disability. There are, for instance, other types of visual impairments, a category called low vision, where people have usable but unclear vision perceptions. Then beyond vision conditions, there are a vast array of mobility, hearing, speaking, neurological, and cognitive differences that might also impact how someone is using a computer and absorbing your site content, some of which we just discussed, with keyboard navigation for mobility, magnification for low vision, and motion considerations for attention deficits and motion sensitivities. Along with WCAG, there are several other guidelines, including the newly published COGA guidance for cognitive and learning disabilities, the ATAG for authoring tool accessibility, and CVAA for communication and video accessibility. The goal of all of these guidelines is to provide a way to account for the diversity of users. In addition, the guidelines help to prevent access conflicts. That is, when you only focus on the needs of one type of technology or user group, you can sometimes create conflicts for others. As an example, some people may add overly descriptive text to an element's accessible name, thinking that they're helping screen reader navigation, but this in turn interferes with voice control, where people are trying to dictate what they see. WCAG has a guideline called Label in Name that tries to balance this, for instance. In the end, accessible design takes knowing the standards and best practices and how to incorporate them.
So back to those inaccessible pages, I'm going to talk about how we evaluated accessibility a few months ago. We did have an accessibility checklist that we'd created internally to check our pages. A team, including people from across marketing and brand design, put it together a couple years ago to start bringing accessibility into our process. This checklist addressed some important considerations. It included things like guidelines around alt text, short for alternative text, which are image descriptions read to visually impaired site visitors, using proper semantic structure, which allows assistive technology to read a page in a way that makes sense, and skip links, which are links at the top of a page that allow people navigating with a keyboard to skip past a bunch of navigation links and into the body of the page. So it had a lot of the important fundamentals, and maybe now you're wondering how we were still designing inaccessible pages even with that checklist. There were two challenges with it. The first was that while the checklist did address a lot of key accessibility areas, it didn't always explain how. For example, there's these two items. Page is keyboard navigable, and page is screen reader friendly. But how do we do that in Webflow? Our team didn't have training in how to use screen readers or how to check keyboard navigability, so we didn't know how to check or measure it. So we had this checklist, but we learned that a checklist alone wasn't enough. We had to operationalize accessibility to better embed it into our processes in a scalable way. The second challenge was that we were primarily using the checklist in the QA stage, which meant we weren't considering accessibility at the beginning of our design process where it matters most. We mostly evaluated accessibility once a page had already been designed and was almost fully built in Webflow. This made it difficult to make any major changes to the design of a page because of deadlines and because we weren't prioritizing it enough. It also meant we weren't giving the right amount of attention to things we started thinking of early on in the design process, like the motion on a page, because we were looking at it in the last step versus thinking about how to design it accessibly in the first place. Overall, accessibility wasn't operationalized in our work beyond this checklist, and we also weren't talking about it nearly enough, especially early on in the design process.
The experience Camille is describing is not uncommon because accessibility is often not familiar to us. In fact, let's talk about why it's often invisible. It's largely due to a societal ill called ableism. At a very high level, ableism is a devaluing of disabled people based on measures such as productivity and capability. This often pushes disabled people into the margins, which causes their needs and accommodations to not be provided by default. This may sound harsh and hard to hear, but it's important to call this out because it impacts how we approach inclusion, who can access our technology, our workplaces, our events, and so on. Consider these scenarios. Disability is rarely part of our day-to-day encounters and conversations, even when explicitly considering diversity, equity, and inclusion topics. It's actually a topic and a characteristic that makes people uncomfortable and even leads to a lot of shame and fear of disclosing a disability, particularly when there are very real discriminatory practices that happen as a result of disclosing or having a visible disability. Or how about this? People praise technology capabilities when presented as innovation, but reject and shun them when they are adjustments and accommodations needed to be inclusive. For instance, we may love our audiobooks and podcasts due to convenience or better comprehension. But when a dyslexic student who benefits from that same spoken aloud text uses that for their learning because they have difficulties reading written text, it's said that they're maybe not reading or getting an unfair advantage when they use it. In the tech world, teams may be aware of what's needed for access, but consider the needs features or requests that are held until later releases. Yes, accessibility may take more time, especially when it's not naturally embedded in your processes. But something like captions or keyboard access are not features you're leaving out. You're leaving out people. There's a tendency to justify some of our behavior with the false narrative that disabled people aren't a large user group or a group that participates in certain areas of focus, as in blind people don't do that or deaf people don't need that. The actual narrative is that disability is present in a significant portion of our population, 1 in 4 adults in the US alone. And instead, we consistently exclude people with our actions such that they can't equally participate. As an example, an organization called WebAIM, Web Accessibility in Mind, recently found that almost 98% of the web's top home pages had fixable, preventable accessibility errors. People don't even realize the part they play in creating or eliminating access. And if you're not mindful, you might view accessibility like so many teams unfortunately do, as an add-on at the end of a project, during an unnamed future rollout, or maybe even not consider it at all. But there shouldn't be a separation of disability, nor an invisibility of it. Instead, it is a digital experience builder's responsibility to create safe and accessible content. There are ways consumers provide for themselves, as in using assistive technology and the various settings. But there is still some responsibility on the business and organization as well. For example, if I visit a physical store, I expect them to try their best to create a safe environment for me, not for me to come in bubble wrapped and ready for falling objects. It's about mindfulness and consideration.
When our coworkers shared with us that our pages were causing harm, we started doing more research into accessibility and disability, and referencing other web accessibility checklists and guidelines. We started to look at how we could change our design and development processes at scale to bring accessible design to the forefront of our work and to better operationalize it within our practice. We tackled this like any designer would, starting with a brief. The tactical problem we were solving for was that we didn't have a single source of truth document for both accessibility standards and how to implement them in Webflow. There's WCAG, which is helpful, but the guidelines are often very technical, which makes them hard to understand, like this one for the reflow success criterion. User agents for technologies such as HTML and CSS, PDF, and EPUB have methods for reflowing content to fit the width of the window viewport. This takes me a couple reads to understand. What is a user agent? What are the methods? We also learned that some key accessibility considerations aren't easily addressed with a binary guideline. You either have sufficient text contrast or you don't, but for motion, for example, it's not as clear. Guidelines say things like, don't use excessive motion, but what does that mean? So we set out on applying our learnings to our own checklist that would accomplish the following. Be easily understandable and written in plain English, include Webflow-specific implementation for development, and include guidelines even for areas that aren't as black and white, like motion. This started as an internal-only effort to make our own pages more accessible. But as we learned more and more, we started to see how pervasive inaccessible web design was. It wasn't just our pages. We started to see that the web design community heavily showcased and favored pages that are inaccessible, whether that means using motion excessively, using effects like parallax, an effect where background elements move at different speeds than foreground elements while scrolling, or not optimizing for assistive technology experiences. Our intent is to be a source of inspiration on engaging web design and no-code development within the Webflow and broader web design communities. we saw an opportunity to leverage our influence there and help others design and build more accessible sites in Webflow. So we decided we'd share the checklist externally for Global Accessibility Awareness Day in May. We created the checklist over the course of a couple months. We wrote the guidelines, came up with the Webflow-specific implementations based on our past builds and with huge help from our engineering team, and designed and built the site in Webflow, since HTML is one of the most accessible formats for media. I'll walk through the checklist briefly. It lives alongside our Accessibility at Webflow landing page, which goes over our various accessibility initiatives and features, and our accessibility statement, which covers our WCAG conformance status. We designed this to be the checklist that we needed when designing and building as a team in Webflow. You can organize the checklist by category, which sorts the guidelines by topics like animation, appearance, controls, etc. You can also sort guidelines by where in Webflow the fixes need to happen. For example, in the audit panel, on the canvas, or in custom code, or by when in the design process to think about it, in design, in development, or in review. So back to this hard-to-understand guideline for reflow from WCAG. I'll use that example again to show how we tried to write these with a less technical audience in mind. Our version of that same guideline is called Allow Zoom Without Forcing Horizontal Scrolling. And the introduction to that guideline reads, people with low vision use zoom to scale content, sometimes up to 400%. As they zoom, content should reflow vertically as a column and remain fully legible and logical without a need for horizontal scrolling. We worked with our UX writer to write all of these in plain English. We also included as much Webflow-specific implementation as we could, whether that's specific step-by-step instructions for how to do something, like this one that explains where in the style panel to add an ARIA label, or code snippets you can copy directly from the checklist to use, like this one that makes the skip link function properly. The checklist also functions like a checklist, indicating how many of the guidelines you've implemented. Maybe my favorite part is the way you can share progress with coworkers. So if you have half of these guidelines checked and you select Copy Checked, that information gets saved in the URL so your coworker can open the checklist, see which guidelines you've completed and which are still left to do. The checklist was a huge group effort. If you want to learn more about how we built it, there's a Webflow blog post that goes into more detail. Creating the checklist helped us start to operationalize accessibility in our practice, and I'll share more about how else we did that in a bit.
As you just heard, incorporating accessibility does take work and intention, but you can get there with the help of many available resources. You can learn to operationalize and equalize it in your organization. Start with some quick wins when using Webflow. Check out the Webflow University article, Make Your Site More Accessible, for some clear, actionable steps you can do now to improve your site's accessibility right away. Couple this by using Webflow's most frequently used components on your site. These elements, such as tabs and buttons, were updated by Webflow accessibility engineers to build accessibility right in, including keyboard and screen reader operability. As you build, check how you're doing with the built-in auditing tools in Webflow. For instance, use the color contrast tool to ensure the color combinations you're using will be easy to see by people with vision impairments. Also simulate how your page will look with common color blindness and low vision settings. Then as you work and before you publish, run a check in the audit panel to flag empty links, out of order heading structure, missing alt text, or insufficient color contrast you may have missed. And of course, you should incorporate the accessibility checklist throughout your processes to cover even more content. Webflow also offers several university courses on accessibility, including how to use the auditor tools, and they have even more courses on the horizon. You can find a summary of all these Webflow resources and up-to-date information about Webflow's efforts on their webflow.com/accessibility page that launched earlier this year. In addition to specific page updates, you can then expand your efforts to include even more education around accessibility standards and assistive technology. This will help you move from accessibility as an extra to-do to accessibility as an embedded process. For individual learning, I recommend starting with the W3C's Web Accessibility Initiative Accessibility Fundamentals resources. These are a wealth of beginner-friendly free resources, such as videos on how people with disability use the computer. These resources will then link to vetted organizations that have built other interpretations, and overall will help you build an understanding for those full official guidelines from the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium. You can also start trying things out for yourself. Your mobile and desktop devices come with a wealth of assistive features built right in. Simply search for access or accessibility in your settings and start exploring. Look at your device's documentation for more information, or even search online for tutorials and first-person demos. Then as an organization, you can incorporate online training from outside accessibility firms, hire accessibility specialists to your staff, and bring on outside consultants to supplement your efforts. All activities Webflow has actually been engaged in behind the scenes with brand design and several other teams. Keep in mind that these efforts, like training cross-functionally, empower every team member to identify accessibility concerns and issues themselves, taking the burden off disabled teammates or coworkers with accessibility expertise and accelerating giving access to disabled consumers. Lastly, get immersed and demystify disability overall. You can join disability accessibility related groups and mailing lists. The Global Accessibility Awareness Day website has a great list of events. You can also learn from disability-focused media and books. Look particularly for media created by disabled people to ensure authenticity, as in the movie Crip Camp. Getting connected to disability-led advocacy groups and individuals who identify as disabled on social media are also great learning tools, and notably the Crip Camp website and social platforms provide a great entry for that. And as a user experience researcher, I certainly can't leave out one of the most powerful tools, incorporating accessibility user research into your processes to get direct feedback. No amount of best practices and guidelines can cover everything, so including diverse voices in your design process will help improve your outcomes. One caution about your journey, however, be wary of companies that claim to have one-button fixes. These solutions often create more problems than they solve, and sometimes these claims just aren't true. Incorporating accessibility is a never-ending process, keyword process. So ultimately be prepared to break down barriers and also iterate. Try things out, see how they feel, and keep adjusting. For instance, Camille, how have things continued to evolve for brand design?
Yeah, our design process looks different now. We incorporated many of our accessibility guidelines into a Webflow style guide we call the boilerplate, which is a thorough component library we use whenever we build a new page. This makes it really efficient for us to use common patterns in our builds that are accessible. For example, the skip link is already incorporated in the nav, and our typography styles are set up with proper semantic tags. Applying our guidelines to this boilerplate has been a crucial part in operationalizing accessibility on our team. Now, when new team members join, they can start building something accessible using the boilerplate with relative ease. Importantly, the discussion starts early now. When we have a design critique, we're talking about whether a page is accessible at the same time as we're talking about whether it tells a story and is engaging. We've also built up a lot more knowledge around auditing a site, so we're thinking about accessibility throughout the design process, and we're also able to test our page builds ourselves. So we learned how to use the screen reader on our devices and what to look for when navigating a site with a keyboard. Some of the specifics we're looking at include things being read in a logical order to screen readers and the right type of element being read out. So using proper semantic tags to label headings as headings and buttons as buttons, for example. The site we designed for No-Code Conf is actually a great demonstration of a page that's both engaging and accessible. As you scroll down the page, the yellow balls slowly move along their channels and the switch flips. It supports the story we're telling with the machinery concept of our No-Code Conf branding, and it's subtle and slow enough to not cause harm. The page also respects prefers reduced motion. So if a person has prefers reduced motion set in their operating system settings, like Michelle showed, the page won't show any motion at all. We wrote about how we did that in a blog post called How to Build for Those Who Prefer Motion and for Those Who Don't, so check it out to find out more. And a couple other things we did for accessibility on this page. We used visible focus state styling by leveraging the latest spec of Focus Visible to provide clear, on-brand styling for people who navigate with the keyboard. We made sure the colors we chose had sufficient color contrast with site text, And the page also includes a skip link that lets someone navigating with a keyboard skip into the body of a page without having to tab through all of those nav links. And we use the list element for static groups of content so that it's read out as such to screen readers. So here, screen readers would read list of 3 items, which verbally conveys the visual content. Our design and development processes are much better now, but there's still a lot for us to learn and to work on. Here's what's next for us. Since the beginning of 2021, we've designed lots of new pages for campaigns, new features, but the pages that we designed before 2021, before we learned all of this about accessibility, need some attention. We'll be auditing those and then redesigning or refactoring the build as needed to make those pages more accessible. And we still have a lot more to learn, especially because as technology evolves, what's accessible continues to evolve too. Like Michelle said, accessibility isn't a one-and-done subject, so we'll continue to engage with educational resources like the one she mentioned. And while we aim to adhere to the latest approved standards as a baseline, we also hope to go beyond those standards. As we've talked about, there's a lot of nuance in accessibility that often doesn't fit in a guideline. Like Michelle said, accessibility is an ongoing process. We still have a lot to do and to learn, and hopefully this has given you some ideas on how to bring accessibility into your design and development processes. And as you go about your days as designers and developers, I hope you start to challenge what you consider to be awe-inspiring web design in the community. Good design is accessible, and we can all start taking steps to make the web more accessible.
Well said, Camille. To recap, we explored how Webflow's brand design team became aware of accessibility, defined what it means to be accessible and why it matters, and discussed how you can follow in brand design's path to intentionally learning and incorporating accessibility into your own work using Webflow and other resources. If you didn't catch everything, don't worry. The team plans to post a blog article recapping our talk after the conference, so be sure to stay tuned for more. Also, as Camille mentioned, Webflow is continuing these efforts throughout the company, so be sure to stay connected for the latest. Webflow is learning out loud and hopes it will help others. It won't always be perfect, but it will be authentic. If you have any questions for either of us, you can find us on Twitter. I'm at MAW Consulting LLC, drop the I from consulting, and Camille is at Camille Espo. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope this has been helpful to you. Bye-bye.